They expected him to run. That's what slaves did when they wanted freedom. But he didn't. He stayed. He listened. He learned. He memorized every rule written to keep him in chains. While others planned escape routes through forests and rivers, he studied contracts, loopholes, and the very laws designed to control him. They thought obedience meant weakness. They thought silence meant submission. They were wrong. Because one day, without ever taking a single step off that land, he walked into a courtroom and walked out a free man. No chase, no bloodhound, no midnight escape. Just the system turned against itself. This is the story of the slave who didn't outrun the law. He outsmarted it. The law in Beaufort County, South Carolina, said many things. It said that a man could be property. It said that property could not read, could not write, could not gather after dark, could not earn wages, could not own so much as the horse it rode or the coat on its back. Law was careful, meticulous even, as laws often are when they are built to protect something monstrous. And it had been written, revised, and sharpened over 200 years, the way a good knife is sharpened, with patience and with purpose. But the law had never met Solomon Pace. Solomon had been born on the Pace plantation in 1821, the son of a field hand named Delia, and a man whose name was never spoken aloud, because speaking it would have made him real, and real meant complicated, and complicated was bad for business. Solomon had been given the surname Pace, as all enslaved people on that land were, like a stamp pressed into wax. It was meant to flatten him into an object belonging to Augustus Pace, cotton merchant, deacon of the local church, and a man who prided himself on his good character. Augustus Pace was not a cruel man by the standards of his time, which is to say, he was a catastrophically cruel man by any honest accounting. He did not enjoy the whip he kept. His bondspeople fed, not generously, but sufficiently. He told himself and others that his enslaved workers were treated well, and he believed it, the way a man believes in his own goodness when that belief costs him nothing. Solomon worked the main house. He polished silver, laid fires, drove the carriage, stood behind chairs at dinner. He was, in the language of the time, a trusted servant, which meant he moved through rooms where white people forgot to watch their tongues, and so he heard everything. He heard about debts and inheritances, and the price of cotton, and the arguments between neighboring families, and the gossip of the county. He stored all of it the way a river stores rain, quietly, without show, until it was needed. He also taught himself to read. This was, under South Carolina law, a criminal act. Not merely frowned upon, criminal, punishable by fine and lash. Solomon had learned in pieces, the way you learn a dangerous thing, a letter here from a discarded primer, a word there from a ledger left open on the desk, a sentence from the family Bible when the house was still. By the time he was 22, he could read as well as most men in the county, and better than some. He told no one. The trouble, or rather, the beginning of Solomon's great maneuver, started in the winter of 1843, when Augustus Pace found himself in debt. Cotton prices had been falling. Pace had borrowed against his land and his assets, which included 112 human beings. The primary creditor was a man named Harwell Croft, a Charleston factor who was sharp with numbers and sharper with his opinions about those who owed him money. Croft had begun making noises about calling in the debt, which would mean the sale of enslaved people. Families split, bodies shipped down the river to the sugar parishes of Louisiana, where most went and few endured. Solomon heard this at dinner. He heard it again in the study. He heard Pace's wife weeping softly in her room about the shame of it, and he heard Pace dictating frantic letters to his brother in Savannah. He put the pieces together the way a carpenter puts together a table, with care, with knowledge of how the joints fit. What Solomon also heard, and what Pace did not fully understand, was a legal question buried inside the debt arrangement. Pace had borrowed money some years earlier with a promissory note that was, by its own terms, due on a date that had quietly passed without resolution. The note had been renewed informally, a handshake, a gentleman's agreement, but the original instrument had never been properly discharged. Solomon did not know the full weight of this at first, but he had also heard at that same dinner table a visiting lawyer named Aldous Whitmore explain at length to Pace's eldest son that informal renewals of debt instruments could, under certain circumstances, be disputed. Solomon thought about this for 3 weeks. He thought about it while polishing candlesticks. He thought about it while holding a lantern for Pace's carriage in the dark. He thought about it in the narrow bunk he shared with 2 other men in the outbuilding behind the kitchen, listening to their breathing slow into sleep, while his own mind turned the problem like a stone in a tumbler. The obstacle was obvious. He could not walk into a courthouse. He could not hire a lawyer. He could not write a letter under his own name without it being treated as forgery, or worse. He was, in the eyes of the law, not a person. You cannot act in a legal proceeding when the law does not recognize your existence. But Solomon had learned something from 2 decades of invisible labor in rooms full of powerful men, that the law was often less interested in truth than in paperwork, and that paperwork could be arranged. There was a free black man in Beaufort named James Cotter. He ran a small chandlery near the waterfront. Candles, lamp oil, rope. And he was, by necessity, a man of extreme caution. Free black people in South Carolina in 1843 existed on a razor's edge. They were free in name, but that freedom was hedged on all sides by law and custom, and the whims of white men who might choose, on any given afternoon, to decide otherwise. Cotter kept his head down, his books meticulous, and his dealings quiet. Solomon had known Cotter for years in the way that people in a small place know one another. By sight and reputation, by shared nods at the market, by the knowledge that they were both navigating the same world from different but equally precarious positions. Solomon found a way to speak to Cotter on a Saturday afternoon when he was sent to purchase lamp oil for the Pace household. They spoke in the back of the shop, among the barrels, in low voices. "I need a letter written," Solomon said, "not from me, from a white man." Cotter looked at him for a long moment. "What kind of letter?" "A legal inquiry about the status of a promissory note." Another long pause. "You know what you're asking." "I know exactly what I'm asking." What Solomon was asking was not, technically, illegal. Not in the exact configuration he had designed. He had thought about this carefully. He did not need Cotter to forge a signature. He needed Cotter to write a letter on behalf of a real person, a minor merchant in Beaufort named Thomas Oakes, who owed Pace a small sum for goods received. Oakes was a vague, distracted man who was often confused about his own affairs. He had once, in Solomon's hearing, complained that he thought he might have a claim against Pace for overpayment on a contract, but he'd never sorted it out. Solomon had no intention of approaching Oakes directly, but he had spent 3 weeks thinking about how a letter written to Harwell Croft's legal agent, not from Solomon, not from Cotter, but purportedly raising questions on behalf of a party who had legitimate standing, might stir the waters in useful ways. The letter, as Solomon dictated it to Cotter in that back room, was a masterpiece of deliberate confusion. It raised questions in formal legal language about the chain of title on the original Pace promissory note. It asked, politely but insistently, whether the informal renewal had been registered. It referenced statute. It requested clarification before any collection actions were taken, noting that such actions might affect the interests of parties with prior claims. None of this was necessarily true, but none of it was necessarily false. And in the world of debts and counterclaims, the mere existence of a question, the mere existence of a letter raising a question, could cause a man like Harwell Croft to pause, to call his own lawyer, to spend time and money clarifying his position before he moved. Time was what Solomon needed. The letter was sent. Croft's agent received it and sent it on to Croft, who sent it to his lawyer in Charleston, who wrote back asking where it had come from, and the inquiry bounced around for 6 weeks while Croft delayed his collections action. In those 6 weeks, Solomon moved on a second front. He had known for some time that Pace's oldest daughter, Marianne, was being courted by a young man named Edward Selby from Columbia, whose family had considerably more money than the Paces currently did. Selby was earnest, a little pompous, and deeply concerned with reputation. He had been coming to the house for 2 years. A marriage would solve many of Pace's financial problems, and everyone at the table knew it, and no one said it directly. Solomon also knew, from years of overhearing, that Marianne was not indifferent to Selby, but that she had reservations about some of his family's business dealings, specifically their ties to a trading company that had recently been the subject of unflattering rumors in the Savannah papers about the handling of merchant accounts. Solomon could not speak to Marianne. That was not the shape of their world. But he could speak to her personal maid, a woman named Grace, who was also enslaved, and who had been Marianne's companion since childhood, and who loved her in the complicated, deep, painful way that enslaved women loved the white women they served, with genuine feeling that was also impossible to fully separate from necessity. Solomon didn't ask Grace to do anything improper. He simply shared in conversation some things he had heard. Specifically, he mentioned that he had overheard, at a dinner some months back, a traveling merchant from Savannah say some interesting things about the Selby family's company, things that a young woman considering her future might want to raise gently with her father before making any decisions. Grace was a careful woman. She thought about it. Then she spoke to Marianne. Marianne asked her father a series of pointed questions about Selby's family finances. Pace, surprised and somewhat unnerved, wrote to his brother in the Savannah for a discreet inquiry. The inquiry came back not alarming, but not entirely clean. Pace decided he needed more time before formally blessing their engagement. More time. By late spring of 1844, the debt collection had been delayed 4 months, Pace's finances had partially stabilized with a short-term arrangement from his Savannah brother. Croft, frustrated with the legal complications around the promissory note, accepted a partial payment and a new formal instrument, properly registered this time, with more favorable terms for Pace. No family was sold down the river. No one ever knew what Solomon had done. That was the point. That was, in fact, the entire architecture of his plan, that it leave no trace, no evidence, no moment where any white man in Beaufort County could point to a black man and say, he did this, he moved this, he outmaneuvered us. The law did not allow Solomon to exist as an agent in his own world. So he had acted entirely through others, through a letter that named no one, through conversations that contained no instructions, through the existing anxieties and motivations of people who had no idea they were being gently, precisely steered. He had not run. Running was the obvious thing, the thing the law expected and prepared for. There were slave catchers for running. There were dogs and rewards, and the Fugitive Slave Act, and all the machinery of a society organized to recapture what had fled. The law had spent 200 years thinking about running. It had spent almost no time thinking about a man who stayed and thought and worked quietly within the spaces the law left open because it had never imagined anyone looking for them. Solomon continued to polish silver. He continued to drive the carriage. He continued to stand behind chairs at dinner and hear everything and store it and think. He did not know and could not have known that 12 years later the world would crack open, that the war would come and the institution would fall and the law that had defined his existence would be annihilated. He could not have known that he would live to see it, that he would walk out of the Pace House in April of 1865 as a free man, 64 years old, his body worn, but his mind still that extraordinary instrument that had served him all his life. What he knew in the winter of 1843 and the spring of 1844 was only this, that the law was written by men, that men had blind spots, and that the most powerful thing a person in his position could do was to know those blind spots better than the men who had written the law knew their own. He had not broken the law. He had found its edges, its gaps, the places where it looked away. He had moved through those spaces like water through stone, not by force, but by persistence, by intelligence, by the unshakable conviction that even in a world designed to crush him into nothing, there was always something left to work with. The law had never anticipated Solomon Pace. That was its greatest failure and his most profound victory.